Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Toronto SMPTE virtual meeting. My name is Lawrence Saint-Onge. I'm the chair of SMPTE Toronto. I'm excited to see all of you here, even though you are connecting remotely. Last count is 103 connected people. So thank you very much. Today we'll be covering HLG is not seen referred an IBC 2024 wrap-up. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items. The order of the day meeting is arranged by Angèle Rochelot-Bourgeois. Our evening protocol: participants can send their questions at any time. A recording of tonight's presentation will be posted on SMPTE Toronto YouTube. Our moderator for tonight is still Angèle Rochelot-Bourgeois from Bell Media. Charles Python, PhD, independent specialist, will be presenting HLG, and Paul Strictly will be presenting IBC 2024 wrap-up. So without further ado, I'll pass the microphone to Angèle.
Thank you so much, Lawrence, for that that great presentation. I just want to open tonight. Grab your drink, glass of water, coffee. We're all engineers, so coffee is the best, a liquid to have. And I want to start off the evening by introducing myself for those who may not know me. My name is Angèle Rochelot-Bourgeois, as Lawrence has said. And I have been in the industry since I was 14 years old. Yes, I probably dated myself there, but 25 years with Bell Media. My craft is post-production editing in both television and film, live production, and engineering. So SMPTE is the best place if you ever want to volunteer and get to know more people in the industry. So make sure to put your name in the hat if you want to. But today I'm just going to share my screen, and I would like to start and introduce our first guest, who's Dr. Charles Poynton, who's an independent PhD. He's a fellow of the SMPTE committee. In 1993, he was awarded the SMPTE's prestigious David Sarnoff Gold Medal in recognition for his work towards integrating the integration of computing and television technology. Dr. Charles Poynton graduated from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, with a BA in mathematics and computer science. He's an independent contractor specializing in physics, mathematics, engineering, and programming in digital colors. So Image is the place to go if you want information from Charles. He has worked many years in the television computing standard organizations to encourage the adoption of standards for the use of television technology in computer environments. So I'm going to pass this on to and open the floor to Mr. Charles.
Okay, thank you very much for that welcome. Just to make sure everyone knows, I'm also interested in the use of computer technology in television. It goes both ways. Tonight's topic for me is HLG is not seen referred. So just to set the stage, and let me work out sharing my screen. Sorry, just take a moment. A little bit of protocol. So then today's topic, this evening's topic, or even this morning, because I think someone has tuned in from Pakistan, HLG is not seen referred. And so to set the stage, HLG is one of 3 HDR standards which are now widely used in, well, I'm not sure if I'd say broadcasting, but I'm going to say video distribution, but obviously including streaming. The three standards are HDR10, which is based on what the so-called perceptual quantizer, or PQ, and the 10 just means it's 10 bits. Another common system is HLG10, which is commonly referred to as HLG, but ordinarily in 10 bits. And the third...
Charles, can I
Yeah.
just intercept here for a moment? Your screen is frozen, but we're not seeing your shared screen if you think you're sharing.
Yeah, I think I'm sharing. Stand by.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, sorry for the confusion. It's a little crazy in my AV over here in my office. So
That's okay.
HDR10, HLG10, and the third, Dolby Vision. And it's Dolby that invented PQ. And Dolby also promulgated ICTCP. I'm not sure how familiar you are with these acronyms. ICTCP is an open scheme for coding color, and it's very loosely comparable to YCBCR, which we've been using for many, many decades. But the Dolby Vision transmission scheme is essentially proprietary to Dolby, so only available in full to licensees. There's apparently nothing preventing anybody else from using ICTCP coding, but and we might guess that other people are using it in kind of set-top box closed scenarios, but Dolby is licensed. So then HDR10 and HLG10 are both openly available and widely used. And the difference is, well, it's what I'll talk about today. So before I talk about the details of HLG, I'm going to give you what some of you might think is a slightly wacky analogy, and don't ever do what I'm doing, sharing your entire screen. It's too dangerous, but I'm going to try to pull it off anyway. Stand by one sec. So then I'd like you to think for a moment about audio, because I'd like to examine the philosophical aspects of what we're talking about in image coding with an audio analogy, because I want to remove the assumptions that you might be carrying about how we do video and television and image coding, and just think about how we create programming for wide distribution. So here's a young lady apparently singing in front of a Neumann U87 microphone at Sweetwater Sound, which, if I'm not mistaken, is in Nashville. And then the second photograph, a pair of Neumann U87s capturing the sound from a piano. And the analogy here is, what resemblance does this have to a video camera recording picture instead of recording sound? So then here's a photograph of Ben Fowler, who's at a very large mixing console, and I'm pretty sure this is also in Nashville. And the question that I want to ask you at the philosophical level, given those two pictures, is for detailed engineering purposes, is it more important in defining the sound that is going to be distributed to characterize the microphones, like to look at the microphone data sheets, or to look at the, I don't think that's a Yamaha NS10, but it looks like a Yamaha NS10, or to characterize the loudspeaker. And keep in mind what's going on. The loudspeaker is at the far end of the mixing console. So Ben Fowler, he's listening to the mix. And I would argue that only after the sound signal has been through Ben Fowler has the sound been turned into its final form. And there is a highly accomplished, both musically and performance-wise, and even in terms of business, artist that works very closely with Ben Fowler. In fact, he gets hugs from her when she finishes an album. That, of course, is Taylor Swift. So then the philosophical question is, what's more important, what's in front of the camera, or what is the experience of Ben Fowler and Taylor Swift when the EQ and the mix and the editing is done? And I think it's patently obvious that the microphone doesn't matter at all. And when I had a conversation about this with another SMPTE fellow, Tom Holman, whose name you might know because he made a crossover signified X for George Lucas in the very, very early days of Star Wars. That led to a company called THX. So Tom Holman, when I had a conversation with him about this over lunch at HPA, as it turns out, said, "You know, Charles, that's absolutely right. I love the analogy, and the way I put it to my students in my class at UCLA Film School, you can make an audio recording with 2 tin cans and a string if that's the aesthetic you want to achieve in the recording." So like the U87 Neumann lovely microphone is just a means to an end. So then having given you that audio analogy, then let me tease you with the idea that when we migrate over to video standards, BT 709, if you read the document itself, it makes no reference in the main part of the document to a display. It also makes no reference to a camera, but we'll get to that in a moment. The trouble here, though, for the video industry is that BT 709, although the standard itself makes no reference to displays, I mean, technically, strictly, theoretically, that is like defining the microphone. And the industry was very casual and lax about this for several decades. BT 709 was adopted in 1990, and it wasn't until 2011, 21 years later, that a proper display standard was adopted, and that's BT 1886. And now I can begin to introduce the terms scene referred and display referred, because 709, strictly speaking, theoretically, it's scene referred. Now, it's relative scene referred. It doesn't report absolute luminance. It's reporting exposure values between 0 and 1, normalized. And you get to pick the aperture and the exposure time and other parameters, ND filter in front of the lens, or lighting in front of a lighting of the scene. You get to control the absolute mapping into that range 0 to 1. But it is scene referred in the sense that even after you've done that Rec 709 optoelectronic transfer function, it's there's a direct mapping backwards. You just invert the OETF, and that inverse is an OETF raised to the -1 power, At least that's how it's typeset. That's how a mathematician ordinarily denotes an inverse. So there's in principle, in theory, an absolute direct link. But in a few minutes, we're going to figure out that that's not the way we use that term in practice. So, going from there to another slide deck, because I'm going to bounce back and forth. Going from there, I want to now talk about the deep philosophy of imaging. So you would start here with this block diagram. It's got a scene, a camera, some sort of recording, distribution, interchange, editing, modifying, color grading, some sort of post process. Or maybe it's just a CCU in a truck, but there's potentially some modification there, and then a display. And then at the extreme right-hand side of this diagram, there's human vision. So there's two huge major reasons why this block diagram fails, even though I think it's figure 1.1 in my 1996 book. But nonetheless, it's wrong. And it's wrong for two reasons. The first reason is you really should label this diagram with absolute luminance levels. And so here I label an outdoor midday clear sky luminance level of 32,000 nits, 32,000 candelas per meter squared. And I labeled the display with a kind of living room, modern consumer TV luminance where the white would be 320 nits. That's a factor of 100 less. And if you were trying to make this block diagram in cinema, the white at the display time would be 32 nits, a factor of 1,000 less. And you'll learn in a few minutes that what happens when illumination varies over such an unbelievably huge range is that, well, basically, to put it in a nutshell, two things happen. One is your sensation of colorfulness drops. And the second thing, and that's called the Hunt effect for color scientists. The second thing is your sensation of contrast drops. And when I say your sensation of contrast, I'm lately, for the last 5 or 10 years, been using the term contrastiness. And the idea there is that any word in the English language ending with the 4 letters NESS describes a perceptual attribute, not a physical measurement. And that's a notion that comes from my colleague, Peter Engeldrum. So I'm not using the word contrast because contrast just on its own without any adjectives, you would, and I would,
sounds like your mic is being covered by your shirt, maybe, because it's muffled every once in a while.
Yeah, okay. I think it's where I'm hanging onto my iPad. Thank
Oh,
you.
okay.
Thank you. I'll improve that. So then the reason it's broken for the second, I should say the second reason the black diagram is broken is this. I tried to get license from New Line Pictures to use a still frame of the movie Pleasantville, which you may have seen 20 years ago. But they never replied to my message. So I had to roto a frame of my own picture. And, at the center of the diagram here is my daughter, Georgia. And whenever my wife sees this picture, she says, "Why?" And that's all of the slides I have on that. But I have one or two others. And where did I put them? I think I have one or two other slides, which will come up later. Okay, so then riffing on that for a moment. Sorry, wrong one. Take a look at this picture. So then this is a picture in a truck. Video HD is being made. You can see a rather odd picture on the right-hand side. And it's a rather odd picture because this is a truck parked outside the Metropolitan Opera in New York. And you're looking at the CCUs. And then if you then look at the people at the CCUs, when you turn the lights on, it looks like this. So then Billy Steinberg is the only guy here that I know, but they are busy making HD live from the Met. And they just happened to do it in a truck because they chose not to have any fixed capital assets in the opera. When they produce a show, they just rent a truck. And Billy ordinarily runs video. He's got his right hand on the CCU. So it's Billy's decision what colors the program has. And, he's in very close communication with the lighting director and the director of the show and the TD of the show. But the color, if you wish, I'm going to introduce the words mastering and approval. It's made by Billy. And then just immediately around the corner is this. And so this is obviously the switcher and the monitor wall, and you can see program and program. I don't know why there's two programs. And then various cameras. They've even called out the first name of the camera operators so that it's easier for the TD to call across the intercom what's coming next. So they're making opera. but it's Billy Steinberg who is deciding the signal processing that makes the color, and the final color approval, it's his in the dark room. And so then if you go back to that, sorry, lost my place. So then it's Billy who's deciding upon the aesthetics of the show and the color. So then just giving you the sort of preview of the HLG wrap up. HLG claims to be scene referred, which is to say, well, it's a problem that BBC never defines scene referred. I mean, they talk about common understandings, but it's not my understanding. And, I think I understand it pretty well. In a few minutes, I'll show you my definitions of scene referred and display referred. But, this keys on the fact that the images for television are ordinarily mastered very dark. And whatever is on that display, that is the master. And Billy, you'll notice, was not actually looking at the opera with his real eyes. And, the typical soccer game camera, soccer game, it would be exactly the same truck, actually, can be used for making sports. And the person making the final color decisions is not opening up the back door and wandering out to the field and looking at the field to make a reference to what the color should be. Color's only indirectly determined by what's outside, and largely that mapping of 100 to 1 or even 1,000 to 1 in luminance levels, it's making a huge big difference. So then when I a moment ago gave you a little hint, Rec 709 theory is scene referred, that's only the way it is in theory. So let me go to a different slide deck and then see if I can find some of the graphs for that. Okay, so then just sketched in a few minutes, historically in HD, and that's when I say Rec 709, I'm more or less referring to HD. In principle, you can do 4K using the same standards, but in practice, many people are moving on to HDR, so either HDR10 or HLG or Dolby Vision. But let's just stick with HD for a moment because it clarifies the concept. What's really important in distribution is whatever you are going to be presented on your consumer display will mimic what Billy Steinberg saw in the truck. Or whoever mastered the material. It could be in a grading suite at Picture Shop. It could be on a truck doing sports. It could be anything you use to originate television. There's a kind of approval or mastering stage, and that is the reference for faithful display. The camera is just a means to an end. And I have a few slides that I can show you to exemplify that in a moment. So what's really super ultra important for standardizing television is what the display does, not what the camera does. And that's our audio analogy again. It doesn't matter that it was a Neumann U87. What matters is the audio quality that Ben Fowler heard coming out of his speakers. And that's the reference after mix and EQ and editing and everything else, that is the reference point for faithful presentation of that material to the consumer. So then and historically, HD video was a 2.4 power function on voltage. And there's a very interesting reason that it's 2.4. I want you to keep in mind that it's 2.4 in a dark room. And then, forgive me, I'm going to just take one moment and switch over to a version of this that I can draw on. So the mapping is from video signal to light. And then typically, well, in a consumer environment, this might be 320 nits. In a studio environment, or in Billy Steinberg's truck, it might only be 100 nits. So then there's a discussion we might have time for concerning what's the absolute level of diffuse white. And then, as you well know, HD, it only really went up to diffuse white. Ideally we'd go up into specular highlights and direct light sources, but that's reserved for HD. So then the crazy thing about video standards is that the EOTF was not standardized at all until 2011. We went for the first 40 years of video with no standard. And the reason for that is that in a CRT, which was obviously the dominant display form, there was a cathode and a grid and an electron gun and a deflection system. And the video was just applied to the CRT. And within the cathode and the grid electrostatics is a 5/2 power law. So that EOTF basically was a byproduct of the physics of the CRT. There was no electronic componentry anywhere in the chain to put in that number. Now, that's of course 2.5. I'm saying 2.4, but the reason is the 2.5 number is if the cathode was infinite in extent. But as soon as you constrain it to a smaller size, the number drops a little tiny bit. It's no longer in perfect accordance with the physics. So now we also are interested in OETF. This is the optoelectronic transfer function that's in a camera, and that is BT709 from 1990, and that's adjustable. And so at first glance, you would say, well, that should obviously be 1/2.4, because we want those things to be, perfectly inverse of the display. But we don't want them to be perfectly inverse of the display. Instead, in order to overcome that 32,000 nit to, well, let's take the broadcast studio scenario, 100 nit. In order to overcome this 320-to-1 ratio of the amount of light, I've already explained that the Hunt effect says colorfulness is going to drop, and the Stevens effect says contrastiness is going to drop. So how do you get over that? Well, there's a trick. You can do a 1.2 power function on each of the linear light RGB. And that does the trick. It's a quick and dirty way to do it. This number needs to change if this luminance level changes, and it needs to change if this luminance level changes. But it's a very good approximation for daylight that 1.2 is a good number. So then many of you, I hope, are thinking, how come I never saw that number before? Like it's never in any video block diagram. And it's never in any video block diagram because although the display, and it's mimicking a CRT, but now, of course, we've gone to LCD and briefly into plasma display panels and now into OLED and, now into other technologies. But that number is still standard. Starting 2011, it's 2.4 at 100 nits. And we cheat to get that effect of 1.2 because when we go to R prime, G prime, B prime, And here I'm indicating primes. They mean perceptual uniformity. We encode with a 0.5 power, and we decode with a 2.4. And mathematically, that's equivalent to the 1.2. Now, some people call the 1.2 the optical to optical transfer function, but I hate that. I think that's terrible. And the reason I hate it is, well, it's not always 1.2, because in principle, 709, if you read the standard itself, it tells you exactly what the curve should be. And its best least squares approximation is a 0.5. It's actually 0.51, or actually, I'm going to do it even more accurately. It's about 0.505. And okay, this is a wacky aside, but some of you may know of Apple gamma, like in a QuickTime file, being 1/1.961. And Resolve calls that Rec 709A. And the A actually stands for Apple, as far as I know. This math is all implicated in the 709 function, and I'll, can't talk about that anymore today because I'll be out of time. Now, the key point with 709, everybody historically adjusted the camera. This is gamma, white balance, black gamma, knee, slope, whatever, historically in the camera. So historically, when you originated RGB or even YCBCR HD, it was already display referred because it was intended to go into a display, not only intended to go into a display, but Billy Steinberg and everybody else running a CCU, they looked at it on a display directly. I mean, you would just take the SYS card or SSD or whatever your media is, plug it into the display and look at it. So then you need to understand that scene referred means there's a mathematical reference back to the light in front of the scene. Even though you may not have the absolute reference, I mean, ideally you would know whether it's 32,000 or 3,200 or 320 or a candlelit scene with 32. There's a variety of scene conditions. Scene referred ordinarily now means absolute scene, means relative scene referred. But it's completely, utterly different from display referred, because what that means is we know the mapping from the voltage to the light. And this is exactly what we care about. This is exactly Ben Fowler and Taylor Swift being concerned about what is the mix? What did you do artistically in the mix? You want to preserve that. You don't want to reference that back to the camera. That was just a means to an end. So then with that, then I show you the tweet stream. So then with all that kind of theory, stand by. It's somewhere else. So with all that theory, but I just might as well show you. Here's what it says in Rec 709. It says optoelectronic conversion. It doesn't say anything about what a display is supposed to do. I mean, it was just implicit for 21 years that a display was supposed to do it 2.4, maybe 2.35, but it wasn't even adjustable. You couldn't mess with it. So then 709 says nothing about displays, but we use the term 709 as if it did. Oh, I missed a few slides here. So here's another visual example of a movie frame. It's a frame from a real movie where you look at it and you think, oh, I'm looking through binoculars. But anybody who's actually looked at through binoculars realizes They don't look like that. There's not two overlapping circles. And the people who made this image, they didn't put a mask in front of the camera and shoot through some kind of mask. They just did it in post. So then what was in front of the camera? Well, that's only a means to an end in terms of the art. Here's another example, a Canadian example, Norman McLaren at the NFB scratching print. And the movie is actually what happens when it's projected. So, okay, this is a little far out there and deeply philosophical, but if you want, you can just scratch onto a 35 millimeter film and make a movie. You don't even need a camera. Okay, so then this is the correct diagram because of that. What you want is the displays match. And because there might be a difference in display conditions, you may do some mapping at a display. In cinema, the exhibition display is identical to the mastering display, but in consumer use, not so much, not necessarily so. So there may be a display mapping that takes place. So now let me show you the tweets. So this was in 2016, so 8 years ago. So then basically I knew what BBC were up to. I knew that they'd started calling it scene referred, and I completely disagreed with them. I basically invited myself to go to the BBC and have a chat. I'm not sure how much of this story I can tell on a piece that's recorded, but let's just say, loosely speaking, they said, get lost. And so then I decided at the time, okay, they don't want to talk to me. I'm going to tweet my definition of scene referred, which is 140 characters. And there's no terminal full stop because there's no room for it. It's 140 keystrokes. So then 6 tweets on the deep concepts. First of all, faithful presentation is the conversion of image light to colored light, image data to colored light, such that image appearance matches that on the display where the creative decisions were finalized. That is the definition of faithful presentation. It's got nothing to do with the camera or what was in front of the camera. Now, then there's a little kind of twist here, kind of a tweak to THX. This definition implicitly references the director's experience, but intent cannot be objectively inferred at presentation time. In fact, it's only a court of law that can decide what intent is. So that's just a little THX thing. They're always talking about the director's intent, and I think it's wrong. Now, display referred, image data having a documented mathematical mapping from image code value to absolute colorimetric light at a display. That fits in 140 characters. And, if BBC tells you, well, the common understanding of display referred is blah, 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 what I say to them is, give me your definition. I'll give you 280 characters. But, if I think my definition just nails it. And then there is a wrinkle, which is mastering display referred. And now this is the display that Billy Steinberg is using. So then mastering display referred is simply display referred, but on the display where creative decisions were finalized. And so, ideally, you'll be using a studio reference display at 100 nits in a very dark room. But we know that people don't. And so we allow some flexibility for the display to map suitable to its luminance setting, which they never give you directly, and suitable to its ambient environment. Okay, so then that's display referred. That's what all video is, according to me, and has been forever. And for video proponents to claim that their system is not display referred, to me, is just complete nonsense. Now, let's then define scene referred, because they claim that HLG is scene referred. But I say scene referred is image data having a documented mathematical mapping from estimated absolute or relative colorimetric light in a scene to image code value. And that absolutely does say exactly what Rec 709 says, but we never use 709 in that way. And so my hope would be that people stop, well, it's never going to happen, but ideally people would not use the word 709. At least technical people wouldn't. They should understand that we're really talking about display referred image data, so we have to talk about a display. And that means you should describe it as BT1886 data, not BT709 data. I mean, I'm okay with producers and directors talking about 709, but people really technical should know the difference. So then let me think how I wrap up. So I think I wrap up by just hand sketching a couple of, oh no, I've got one already. Okay, now one thing you need to understand is historically, we did display mapping by using different gamma values depending upon the display and ambient conditions. And here I'm showing you the display condition. This is just nits. So at a studio, at consumer premises, and in the cinema, or maybe or D cinema or home cinema. So where the whites are only 32 nits. Yeah, I know the reference point is 48, but there's typically a little bit of headroom in the cinema. The whites are usually around 32. And then I'm showing you a little bit about the ambient environment. This is the surround ratio as a fraction. So cinema pitch black, HD, probably 1 nit surround historically. HDR maybe a little brighter, maybe 4 nits. And then the consumer environment can range anywhere from 0.05 to 0.15 ratio, ordinarily viewed lighter. But if it's luminous and in a light surround, then we basically tweak the power function in order to compensate that Hunt effect and the Stevens effect to place the colorfulness and the contrastiness to where they're supposed to be. Now, HLG basically builds in a 1.2 function adjusts. So their EOTF has got a term that's dependent not upon the white reference at the display, but rather the
Charles, you keep cutting out.
okay, sorry, I'll move my microphone. So the HLG standard, and it is documented in BT 2100, it is referenced to the peak absolute luminance of the display. I think it should be referenced to the average. Sorry, to the diffuse white. And then they build in the 1.2 number, and then they say that's how the camera should map. So it fails for two reasons. One is there isn't even necessarily a camera, and you've heard that that's kind of deep philosophy. And then the second point is the variation in luminance in front of the camera might be 10,000 to 1, which is way more than the 10 to 1 that you need to accommodate for display mapping. So scene rendering is fundamentally way larger than display rendering, and display rendering is the only thing. And the other point that you could mention to the BBC is, do you allow people to turn knobs during production or post? Because the 2100 standard has got an absolutely strict mathematical link. There's no option in 2100 to turn any knobs. It's it's relative scene referred with a fixed 1.2 function, and that 1.2 function doesn't vary. So if you claim to be HLG HDR, then you're not allowed to turn any knobs. And last time I checked, BBC have got CCUs just like the rest of us. Definition. And I remain open and have for the last 9 years to hear what is BBC's definition of scene referred. As far as I'm concerned, is display referred like every other television system on the planet. So with that, I have time for like maybe one or two questions.
We had a question from Sohaib Imran. I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to. Oops. If you want to go ahead and ask your question.
So, hello, can you?
Hi.
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can hear.
I'm not able to hear you guys. Maybe there's something at my end. I've just put the question in the chat. If you can speak it out, it will go.
Sure. So Sahib was asking, where does the 1.2 come in?
Yeah, where does the 1.2 come from? So basically, when in 1996, when I wrote my first book, I called it 1.25. At that time, 30 years ago, like everybody making video knew that the camera was not the inverse of the display, but there wasn't a deep understanding why. And in my 1996 book, I called that rendering intent. And I had that correct in the use of the word rendering, but not correct in the use of the word intent, largely because I stole that term from the nascent ICC color management community. In recent work, I call it, well, I divide it into two: scene rendering and display rendering. So then the scene rendering is overcoming the Hunt and Stevens effects, and the 1.2 power on linear light signals turns out to be a good first approximation, but you want to drop that power down to maybe 1.1 if the scene is rather dark, like not outdoor bright light. The 1.2 is approximately optimum for about 3,200 nits in the scene, which is an overcast day. If the day is clear and it's noon, then you want to raise that overall number to about 1.3. The way that was historically done is the cameraman tweaking the gamma knobs on the camera. I mean, in the case of a display referred signal, you know, you want to shoot, as we call it, or record the video, bring it back to the studio, have it go to air, and it's already ready. That's kind of the news scenario. And, you know, where the 1.2 number comes from, it changes as Billy Steinberg, in my example, changes his CCU settings. So then it isn't fixed. It's an aesthetic parameter set by the person determining the look of the video. But 1.2 generally works okay. Now, you know, the BBC pretend that it's rigid, but it's not rigid because they still use CCUs and they still have senior video operators. So it is not the case even with BBC originated HLG that number 1.2 actually relates to what's in front of the camera. Now I'll get to spend 30 more seconds and tell you for HDR, all of these principles are still absolutely there, but now we can approach them in a more sophisticated way, even getting close to what a color scientist would call a color appearance model, which is then an algorithmic set of equations that mimics how we perceive color and contrast differences and adjusts that according to a set of formulas. And so HDR in the Dolby fashion, it's like that. The other thing is that the 1.2 number, it's really not very much about the display. It's mostly about the scene. And, you can read chapter 5 of my PhD thesis and it'll give you everything you want to know about it. And stop there, because you can no longer get a PhD from an 80-page thesis. It has to be 160 pages. So there's basically 80 pages of fluff after chapter 5, but you don't need to read beyond there.
Perfect. One last question, and we will, just for everybody who's still on with us, at the end, we will open the floor for both Charles and Paul. One last question from Caleb is, what do you think of the HLG's varying EOTF's display characteristics and condition? Because you made a tweet once that the gamma shifts are fairly legacy way of handling surround compensation.
Yeah. So this is a super good and super detailed question. And I'll have to give you a very brief answer. If you read 2100, you read the math. And they don't directly alter gamma on the RGB directly. Instead, they've got a kind of wacky equation. And let me see if I can quickly just find a blank page and screen share that little scroll with you. One sec. All right, so you're seeing a blank screen, I hope?
Yeah.
So then historically, we would have done red and green and blue to the 1.2. And that would be one way to do it, but that's not how they do it. Instead, HLG, and you can read this in 2100, they first form linear light luminance as a fraction of red plus a fraction of green plus a fraction of blue. And then they say red at the display. I think Zoom is taking a lot of cycles here, and I'm not able to draw easily. They take red at the display equals red at the source times luminance to the 0.2. Green at the source at the display is green at the source times luminance to the 0.2, and blue, same thing. So, sorry, Y. So this is a kind of odd way to do the kind of rough equivalent of a 1.2, because the R and the G and the B have all effectively got an exponent of 1. And when you multiply them together, that is sort of like the 1.2. However, then they adjust this number based upon a ratio of logarithms that depends upon the local display. So really what they're doing is display mapping, and it's got nothing to do with scene mapping or scene rendering. And so what I've told you is scene rendering, because it has to operate over 10,000 to 1, not just 10 to 1. It's way more significant than the display mapping. So somehow the HLG proponents think, well, display mapping is the thing. But I disagree. I think that scene mapping is the thing. So then that's the quick answer. And, there's much more to be said, obviously. So then now that I've got the screen shared, though, I wanted, in conclusion, and this, that will be the last question, but in conclusion, I do want to tell my local Toronto colleagues that I'm going to be teaching a one-day seminar in Toronto, the middle of December. It's applied color science for film production, but when I say film, I also mean digital film. And it's kind of the whole color thing, end to end, 1 day long, really intense. And I'd just like to share that. So just write down my email address, workshop@poynton.ca, and I'd be happy to see you there. I'm hoping that your employer will pay for your ticket. But if your employer's not going to pay for your ticket, you could just send me an email and say that, and we'll see if we can do something. There you go. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Charles. Again, if you have any questions, please keep them for the end, and we will have an open forum for anybody who wants to ask any questions. We're going to move on to our second guest of the evening, Mr. Paul Steckley, President of Applied Electronics. He's been a SMPTE member since 1996, and like many of us, he got his first start in the governance of SMPTE at the section level, like myself. He graduated from the University of Waterloo, completing a postgraduate at the University of Western Ontario. He joined Applied Electronics in 1983. He founded and ran the Audiovisual Systems Division until assuming the president role in 1998. That's incredible. He holds 3 Canadian and US patents for display systems and is currently principal president and owner of Applied Limited. He's going to be talking to us about his IBC, which he has privately shared with me, but he believes it to be his 28th, which is incredible. He's also got a bit of a surprise for us about another IBC that he attended that he's going to be presenting to us. So I'm going to pass it on to Paul.
Yeah, let's see if I can and thanks, Charles, for that. Every time I think I know everything about color science,
I agree.
I find something else out. Have I started to show my screen correctly?
Not yet.
Okay, I may have to just go to this one and yes, and then you'll have to excuse me while I go to picture mode. I remember also, Charles, when I found it very interesting when you talked about the CRT, that we didn't need an EOTF because we had CRTs before. And I remember when you used to be able to buy a CRT or a SMPTE spec CRT. So anyways, I'm going to talk about IBC. Yes, best guess that it was my 43rd trip to Amsterdam, my 28th IBC. And Angel, if you want to know what you have in your future, I've shown the organizers of NAB my first coin from my first NAB, which was Chicago 1970. I went with my father at the age of 11 and worked the show in the 70s and 80s while in high school and university. So I'm going to keep this I keep this presentation fairly light. I'm cognizant and was mentioning before we went on tonight that I am a vendor. So I try to be fairly generic in the presentation. But if you want to ask me specific questions about technologies, I'm going to cover a few key technologies that we saw. Just added a picture about AI because I saw the new Tom to say he was going to give himself over to the AI revolution. So I think I'll have to see the ad again, but I think we're about to see the first Tom Hanks at the age of 20-something again. He looked about the same age as in the big movie, but there was a little bit of development about that. I recently had eye surgery, so figuring you don't want to see my nose, I'm going to take my camera off while I look a little bit too closely at the screen. So this is one of the, this is the main entrance into IBC. This is one of the main photo spots. It was very nice of them to add it because I think just about every company and participant who was there posed in front of these life-size letters. It was a very nice touch, and I presume they can just change the numbers in future years. A bit of boilerplate here. These are the 6 owners of IBC. It's been considered a kinder, gentler show than a lot of the commercial shows, NAB being a little bit more of a commercial show. It is a not-for-profit show. It is owned by 6 not-for-profits. I have the pleasure of serving with 2 of those not-for-profits, with SMPTE and the IABM. So I do get to see the numbers in the business side of that through my role at SMPTE and a little bit on the board of the IBM. You'll see the SCTE, the IEEE calls themselves the BTS, the Broadcast Technology Society. The Royal Television Society is a legacy society that's been around the UK for a while. I'm not really sure what the Institution of Engineering and Technology does, but they've always been on the board. A little bit of back story to IBC. This is the first year that it was actually incorporated, if you can believe it. To those of us in business, to find out that it used to be an unlimited partnership, basically a little more than a handshake agreement when the show started. The liabilities and such were always rather alarming, so it was just incorporated in the UK this year. And SMPTE, for example, owns 11% of the IBC show and gets a significant part of the revenue from that. This is the RAI in Amsterdam. This is the layout of it. As you can see, it's a little bit kludged together as they built out and expanded the RAI. It's a very nice looking building from the outside, but it can be a bit of a maze on the inside. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way the show is organized, and in particular, when you note there that halls 1, 7, and 8, for example, are a little bit bigger. Hall 14 in the front is actually was built originally as a temporary expansion structure that kind of just became permanent. They never took it down. And you'll see all the other halls and how they fit into the organization. Would point out one thing that did come out this year in the show is, I'm not sure if many of you would have seen the protests in the Catalonia province where Barcelona is in Spain. There were a lot of protests and whatnot about tourism overrunning the city and trade shows, and basically the city residents saying that their quality of life has been impeded by too many people from out of town coming in for either business or pleasure. Surprised to hear that the same thing has happened to Amsterdam. Over the years, the show threatened to move when the costs got very high. So, for example, most of us get our hotels through what's called RAI housing, which is something that was meant to sort of organize and mitigate the costs of hotels. It is a very, very expensive show and place to visit, unfortunately. But the city of Amsterdam sort of let things go up about 12% in price this year for the show. Saying that the same sort of concerns from local residents. So one of the comments that came back is that eventually we'll be going to Germany for shows because that's the only country that seems to want them anymore. But it was interesting to start to see some pushback about shows and excessive tourism taking over Amsterdam, which of course it does almost all the time. The show itself. So the RAI has a convoluted layout, which can still confuse a show veteran like myself. I still find myself getting lost less than I used to. Halls 7, 8, and 1 are the largest shows and tend to attract the most traffic in the larger booths. So you'll see some of the marquee vendors and whatnot. Those larger booths tend to be in halls 7, 8, and 1. Temporary hall 14 was put back this year. Area where it didn't need to be, and even amongst that there was a lot of empty spaces. You didn't see that at IBC. They open and close halls in the RAI to accommodate, and this year the show was pretty much back full to all the halls. Traditionally you saw the same exhibitor in the same spot year over year, and there were rough technology groupings in some halls. So when you go up the stairs, there were smaller halls like 10, 11, and whatnot. For example, I believe it was Hall 10 used to be the where cameras, lighting, lenses, and whatnot. So, but actually, since coming out of the pandemic, it's been a controversial move. IBC has adopted the NAB style of booth selection, where exhibitors compete to keep their spaces or improve it. So we had small vendors, and it was one of the ways that attendees could navigate the complicated RAI, because you tended to have the waypoints of, oh, that's that vendor, we must be in this hall, et cetera, et cetera. It hasn't varied a lot because most people have been able to cling, but this year they turned up the dial a bit on that, and it's starting to shuffle as such, the layout of the show, and it will shuffle even more next year. In the NEB layout, they have what are called anchor booths. So I guess it's a status symbol in the business if you're suddenly considered an anchor booth. The big companies, the Avids, Grass Valleys, Sony's, going to show you a picture of Ross in a moment. They are distributed throughout the show, both at NEB and at IBC, to distribute the traffic so that people just don't crowd around all the big marquee exhibitors, if you will, and spread out a bit. And that's, again, one of the changes we've seen. Now, one of the things I'll point out is I keep taking pictures of the generic show in case somebody asked me to do a wrap up. This year I did not. So I've been mooching pictures all day, and these ones are courtesy of Ross. I believe Ross was one of the biggest, if not the biggest booth. I added the picture of how many staff they took there, because that's got to be the largest number of staff that I saw at the show. But of course, Ross, a big supporter of SMPTE, both in the Ottawa section and around the globe. But that's they're considered an anchor booth, and so you won't find them close to another big name like Evertz or Avid or whatnot. They're spread around the people. So there were 45,000 verified compared to other shows that count badges. So again, maybe it's a bit unfair, but we've often criticized NEB and other shows because a lot of us go there with 2 or 3 badges, and they tend to get counted multiple times. The IBC show, like Infocom, which is also not shown by a not-for-profit, are verified attendees. So when you compare the number of 60,000 to at NEB to the number of 45,000, I would suggest the attendance was quite a bit closer on those 2 shows. So just for comparison, the peak just before the pandemic was just over 54,000 people. But then again, no show is, and 45,000 was considered a very, very good result. So show will meet or slightly exceed the best financial result for its owners, which SMPTE and you saw the other 5 member companies that are all not-for-profits that own it. This was the result of cost cutting and other things that were done. So even though the show isn't quite as big, and this is a show, by the way, that virtually nobody pays to go to. If you show up at the last minute at the door, you will get charged for a badge. But by and large, like most of the shows these days, attendance to it is free. So the financial result is driven by the booths and the vendor side of the booth, which is great for exhibitors, or for attendees, I mean, who don't want to pay for badges. So between some cost cutting and the fact that the show is virtually right back to where it was, the financial result for SMPTE and others was at, or when the final accounting done, may have actually set a proportional record. General consensus as to who was showing up is the right people were still attending, but just in smaller groups. So imagine big US network, 3-letter network. They're still attending, just where 30 went to NAB, 12 to 15 went to IBC. Now it's 4 to 6. So, and that often brings sort of the higher quality decision makers and whatnot. One of the things that was noted, I think NAB cleaned it up, is there weren't a lot of what we used to call the backpackers, the people who really didn't seem to have anything to do with the industry, but had got into the show. Obviously, Amsterdam isn't as easy a location to do that in the first place, but generally the audience is considered very, very high quality. If you're an old veteran of the show like me, you will remember curiously wondering why every time you walked into a hall, you were barcoded. So when you walked in the front door, a person standing near the barcode reader would shoot your badge. And again, when you walked into all of the other halls, they would do that again and again and again. And you'd wonder, why is this person barcoding me for the 20th time this show? And it's because they used to provide metrics as to where people were walking. So if you were in one of the halls themed for cameras, lighting, support equipment, lenses, and things like that, somebody would get that metric. It was briefly tried to use facial recognition coming back from the pandemic. You had to have a picture to get in. I hear that didn't work so well, but now that they're starting to randomize the booth locations, that seems to be the reason that they've given up on attendee tracking and whatever cost it was doing. But that was a unique part of the show that's now gone by the looks of things. The show was shortened from 5 to 4 days post-pandemic. So I go to typically Infocom, ISC, NAB, and IBC every year, and some other shows thrown in there for good measure. And the last day of IBC 2024 was the busiest I can ever remember at any show. Normally they're very, very sparse at NAB and other shows. And it was pretty incredible how busy it was on the last day of IBC, and a lot of people commented on that as well. So it wasn't a ways to shorten it. These are just some generic pictures of typical crowd shots in some of the bigger booths. So again, you see Evert's there, an anchor booth of one of the halls. And just generally, the show was seen to be very brisk. The aisles are not nearly as wide as at NAB and other shows. There's no empty spaces to, the same way there are at other shows. So it does feel a little bit like a kitchen party. It does give you the sense always at IBC that it is more crowded and more energetic. This was just some random pictures that I did happen to take on the very last day. Perhaps the one on the top left doesn't look that busy in front of another Canadian company, Matrox. But for example, the picture to the lower left was a booth in one of the smaller halls actually, and everything seemed very, very busy on the last day, and we were there completing the last of our meetings right up to the last minute of the show. The IABM theater, a lot happens. It's a big focal point. Being on the IABM board, I often get accused of this, that, or the other thing with the show, thinking that the IABM is somehow running the show because they're quite their presence is quite prominent in the theater with the BAM awards that they have and whatnot. But IABM is a advocacy group for its member companies. So it's prepared to complain about the show if their members say so, but they have a very large presence there. It's one of the main events for the IABM. And I think even though you have the NAB theater and similar things at other shows, IBC tends to have this as a much better focal point in meeting place for events that happen during the show in the IBC theaters. Strangely, they moved it out of the permanent theater into another room space this year, but again, a very good focal point and meeting place at the show. So general comments about the show, similar to what we saw at NAB, with it being less showing new technology, general impressions. I mean, so similar that people have looked at the show less as a, oh, I'm going to save up and introduce my new thing at the show. It's more about meeting with the clients and having a client experience. And most people think this has been a much happier and more productive use of trade shows with all the electronic communications we're doing now. Why do we have to meet when I can get a webinar on anything that's new these days? So this has been one of the evolutions that was noted at the NAB wrap-up, and certainly a big part of IBC. Happy hours, again, going back 20 some odd years, I was surprised that to see on my first IBCs that more than half of the booths would have draft beer taps on them, and it was a real big deal at IBC, whereas you didn't see much of that in the show itself at NAB 20 30 years ago. But now those happy hours are just about everywhere in every booth, and they were starting earlier and earlier and earlier, especially as the show progressed. I would say if you needed a beer, you could get one anytime after 2 or 3 o'clock on day 3 or day 4. There was an old saying about new technology, see it first at NAB and find out if it's real at IBC. And again, I think both shows have evolved to be much more similar now, but there used to be a lot more whisper suites, we called them at NAB, that weren't necessarily open to the average showgoer. You had to be invited. They would show you futuristic technologies, vendors would show you futuristic technologies, and then you show up at IBC and find out whether it was real. And the show was always more open, and you know, there were few, if any, whisper suites ever at IBC. But again, a lot of things that you saw new at NAB, a lot of people would sort of fact check them at IBC to see if they had progressed, if they looked like they were going to come to market. And obviously less so at IBC waiting for NAB, just because the time frame between IBC and NAB is so much longer. So that still goes on in terms of you know, trying to catch up on gossip on companies and things like that. It's always been a very good show for gossip. Seeing some return to new introductions timed with the show. Companies like Ross, for example, seem to be timing a lot more of their introductions to the show. So coming out of the pandemic, it was all about getting back together, but now we are seeing a little bit of that. I don't think it'll ever go back to where you had to be at NAB to see what was new. You're more or less there for the interpersonal experiences. Over the years that we've known that generally the European broadcasters were far more IT centric, but also that gap has been closing. So for a country like Canada, where we've got a very large country and very few people in it, I've always thought the Canadian market was a little bit more progressive in terms of adopting some of the IT technologies, and companies like ourselves would go to IBC to find those technologies. We still find it the best show to go find new nuggets of technology that we can either track for 2 or 3 years before introducing them to our customers, or that we can see and bring right back to our customers. And with software, all of a sudden adopting something or trying it out for a while is getting a whole lot easier. So we still do find it one of the best hunting grounds for that new upstart company that's got that new great technology. The best quote I heard at the show was at one of the dealer and customer meetings, and it was, "We are in the new reality where broadcasters are competing against the streamers who are themselves losing tremendous amounts of money." And that was by Luis Hernandez, the head of the financial organization that owns Grass Valley. And it was sort of wrapping up their offsite meeting, and I thought, how true is that? You're hearing about all the difficulties within, say, Disney. You know, we've all known that Netflix uses financial capitalization to, you know, to show a better number than perhaps they do on revenue. But you know, you've got Amazon and Netflix now showing ads trying to boost revenues. Disney and Peacock trying to bring more and more unique content. We're starting to see the sports content get eroded. Yet when you go back to all those streaming companies, you can't really point at any of them and say, hey, they're making a lot of money. Yet it's the reality to which broadcast needs to compete these days. And I thought that quote summarized it very well. This is just a top of the escalator looking into Hall 7. This is one of the bigger halls. It is on the last day, so it looks a little bit more spaced out. But this is one of the high traffic halls. That company Synergy, for example, has managed to maintain that space for as long as I can remember at the bottom of the escalator. But again, you would come from, say, Hall 1 through Hall 7. And yes, the halls don't necessarily flow that well to a very, very long corridor to the other small halls at the other end of the Rye. So much more compact than NAB, but still you wear a good set of running shoes when you're doing IBC. So technology, no real quantum leaps versus NAB, I would say. A big change, I think, that we've seen in the whole industry is customers now look for ROI versus technical excellence. So they used to go to trade shows looking for the best of the best. And now it's basically about how much content can I push? What are my cost structures associated with that technology? So it's very much an economic discussion that you're having as much as a technological one these days. And no more evident was that than at IBC this year. You tend to see the upper executive coming, so they may or may not be more technical. They're certainly not the users who will ever handle the equipment, so they don't need to see a demo. So that's the shift in the discussion. Seeing the all parts of the broadcast workflow shift to virtualized software. So we've talked forever about software replacing everything, but now it's virtualized software replacing everything. So there's really no part other than cameras and microphones. Virtual sets have now become a mature, reliable, easily deployable product. You have virtual audio boards, of course, graphics and newsroom edit has been software for a while, but now we're seeing that run on completely COTS hardware versus bespoke hardware. Production switchers, we're really seeing a lot of the production workflow now being done in software. So it's, again, outside of cameras and microphones, there's virtually nothing we can't do in software, but even some of those earlier embodiments of software were often on a bespoke, needed this special card, needed this special config, but now we're seeing it all evolve to virtualized software. And that means, hey, if you want to put it in VMs in your plant, if you want to put it in the cloud, it doesn't matter anymore. It's all about software first, and where you decide to put it is a business decision secondary to the software. But there is a significant dichotomy that we're seeing in the industry for software that is cloud enabled versus software that must be on the cloud. So some software which can be on-prem still has some of the billing modules that must be in the cloud, so the vendor can see it and bill you appropriately. So that's kind of one of the under the hood things that we really see in the market and at IBC this year is sure, just about everybody's headed to software and virtualized software, but who must be in the cloud and who gives you the choice. And the other thing that's changing is more and more product is available as SAS, software as a service only. The cost model, broadcast has always been a very capital intensive business, but as we go to software as a service, you'll find the 10-year ownership. Venture capital companies that own a lot of the broadcast business like it because it's a longer, more steady revenue stream rather than the ups and downs of a various sales cycle. But we're seeing more and more product now, which is only available as software as a service. I still try to get answers, and if anybody has any comments on that, what the business wants. I tell vendors, give people the choice. Whether to deploy it cloud, on-prem, SAS, or purchase. That's frankly not where the industry is going. So it's one of the first questions you ask when you're traveling around IBC and other shows these days. What's the economic model of your technology? Where can I keep it? And how do I pay for it? One of the more common examples of that is Grass Valley's AMP. It was talked about a lot at the NEB wrap up that we had at the Amazon headquarters. One of the truly freaky technologies that didn't show so well on the floor, but in their off-prem meeting was their virtual goggles using the Google goggles. They basically showed you the view that the person's seeing behind the lenses. They dropped a production switcher in front of them virtually. They moved the panel around, said, I want the panel this big, 1 ME, 2 MEs, and constructed the panel and then began to push the buttons and operate it in midair. It looked ridiculous, but it was one of the coolest, most profound things that a lot of people pointed to at the show. So if there was did you see that product? I'm not sure how many people are going to stand there and move their arms up and down doing a switcher. It seemed to work very well when it was demoed, but it was it'll be interesting to see what the market uptake on that is. But it was a little bit of a show stealer. Integrated multimedia production. So going back to the comment that we're all looking at competing with streamers, and that this thing called television, this 16:9 format, which I keep reminding people isn't 4K, it's a SMPTE format, slightly narrower than 4K, that came out of the late 1980s. Various debates on whether it was the right format at the time, but it is what we have in this thing we call television. So the convergence of broadcast and multimedia production is in full swing. So the IP networks that are, and I would say one of the things that we clearly saw from NAB to IBC is, I think in terms of SMPTE 2110, we've crossed the cost barrier now, is that the costs are now very competitive, especially as you get into larger networks compared to an SDI deployment. When IP first hit the scene, it was expensive, less reliable than we'd like, and took a lot of technical know-how. I think 2110 now is just another cable that we attach, and I think it now has allowed us to get past that cost barrier. So now when we talk to little company out of Scandinavia somewhere. So we've seen automated sports production systems. They really haven't had commercial uptake, but we've seen ones that in particular look at the behavior of the individual rather than try to follow a puck or a ball. And they were mostly associated with soccer and hockey. And they use what's called the 1-2-3 system. Sometimes you can ask me what that means, but it basically calls people a 1 or a 2 or a 3 based on their behavior in the terms of the play. It is a true AI because they show it 10,000, 20,000 games of whatever sport they're trying to teach it, and then it learns to the commonalities of that behavior and begins to look at people. Why is this of interest? Well, obviously for the reason of doing an AI to auto-produce sports, but also to auto-produce other productions and multimedia formats. So you'll notice the nice convenient squares that AI is making as it tracks various people. Well, this can be deployed into integrated multimedia production. So I had a couple of customers come up to me and say, hey, did you see this thing at Viz? And I said, well, actually, they showed that when they bought the NDI product line and they first introduced it at IBC. But nobody really took notice or cared. And now everybody cares about it. So knowing that the audience is not necessarily going to be a 16:9 audience going forward, and frankly isn't a 16:9 audience now, we're looking at various production workflows that are now quite possible using some of the new AIs that have been hanging around for a while for camera tracking, automatic sports production, and the ability of those to simultaneous multimedia production. And it's not necessarily a new concept as far as we're concerned, but it was one thing that at IBC we said, okay, we take that tool, and that tool, and we start doing some proof of concepts, and we think we maybe finally be there. So the future of television, there was a lot of discussion going around at IBC and NAB New York about where the industry is going. Everybody used to try to euphemistically talk around what's really going on, and everybody seems to be out in the open now with the discussion about ROI. There's no taboo any longer to talk about the consolidation of television. It's been all over Canada and the US. It's happening, and it's finally being discussed in the open, and especially when everybody's away from home and you've got more of the senior executive, certainly from North America, traveling to this show in particular. So as TV declines, media companies need to transition from as content providers to any platform. I mentioned the IABM, so there's up to 600 members in its past of broadcast industry. Avixa is the same company. You can be individual and smaller tier members, but by and large, it is mostly a conglomeration of the companies in the AV business, which is orders of magnitude bigger than broadcast. But for 2023 was the first time that IABM and Avixa not only started keeping specific numbers for it, but started sharing them with each other. And everyone agrees that the fastest growing area is corporate communications, and that studios are being built out as large corporations like banks, energy companies, etc., resources companies try to control more and more of their own communication strategies. So I said, see you at ISE. That show had a sudden expansion last year of broadcast companies entering it. I've heard many more will enter it this year. It's a show in Barcelona that will probably easily exceed both the IBC and NAB attendance numbers. It was 30,000 people bigger than IBC before the show, but it's one of the shows that we're watching for the whole approach to mixed media. It's not AV, it's not broadcast, it's a media show, and they seem to have got the right formula for the future. So that's myself and Marc de Montigny from our Quebec office in front of taking our photo op. This is on the very last day, so we were very proud of ourselves for looking that fresh in Amsterdam. And if it's okay with you, Angele, I'm going to take about 5 minutes and I'll briefly talk about one we went to last week.
Absolutely.
So a show that was franchised a while back. Now, I don't think it was so much this year done with the Sports Video Group, which is another organization that's growing hand over fist. But this is NAB New York last week. It was held in the Javits Center. Coming out of the pandemic, it was very, very well attended, in part from the people who really couldn't get travel approval. And of course, when we started going back to NAB and IBC, we were still really in the last throes of the pandemic. So not everybody wanted to travel. So this is a spin-off regional show from NAB. And we hear a lot of feedback that big shows are so expensive and people wanted small regional shows. This year's attendance was said to top 12,000 people for a 2-day show. I thought that was very, very good. Frankly, it didn't look that busy, but a lot of the attendees, of course, New York and LA are the hubs of the industry, more of the content creation side in LA, but certainly the network side is mostly centered in New York. So a lot of the attendees come for specific meetings with vendors versus attending the whole show. So you don't tend to see the people wandering around for the whole 2 days. The show just as an attendee just isn't big enough to do that. So a lot of people coming and going. Seemed down a bit in exhibit space and attendance, which surprised a lot of us because it was so inexpensive and easy for so much of the broadcast business to attend. But a lot of that was blamed on that little hurricane thing that was coming in. I found out that about half the people I know in the broadcast business own some property in Florida, and they were all talking about a 100-year event. Yeah, 2 of them in 2 weeks. And of course, the run-up to the U.S. election has been especially brisk this year in the broadcast business. The understatement of the show. Anyways, these are a few of the just some general aisle shots. Knowing I was going to come visit you today, I did manage to take some pictures of this, but a relatively good crowd. At times, NAB has actually limited the size of booths to make sure this stays a very economical show. I call it a 50-foot show because I can't walk more than 50 feet before I see somebody I know and get embroiled in a conversation. Everybody says that. We're just a few feet later, we're all in another group talking to each other, and so minimal amount of product, and again, very much a meeting place show. This guy was showing some workflow and talking about people having to wear many hats these days. So he kept showing part of his workflow and putting on another hat. I saw him about halfway through the shtick, And he was about 5 or 6 hats in one of the bigger booths, Fujifilm. The Javits Center is very, very nice. Those of us who've ever looked for restrooms and restaurant space at any of the bigger trade shows really like it because it's spread out that way. This is held in conjunction with the AES to cut down costs, and that was in another hall, and they tended to put most of the audio people there on the AES side. But it's a very easy show to go to. And it's, again, for a lot of us to where we catch up on a lot of the gossip versus looking at product. And that's me and Paul Roser. You remember from his activities in the Toronto section, leaving also in very good shape on the last day. And that's it, folks. I can
Thank
turn
you
on my
so much.
camera now.
Thank you so much, Paul. Every time I had a question and I was writing it down, you were answering it. So I was like, oh, he's pretty good. One of the questions that I had, and those who have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A in Zoom, was what do you, in your opinion, what do you see the trend being next year as we move more into the AI and then more into the VR and more of the, you know, software as a service? What do you see being the trend next year?
I think we're in, and again, it's a tough thing to say out loud, but I think we're sort of in the last chapter of bespoke television. We've had the OTT departments, which companies like us are finding out are really much better funded. But you look at our business in Canada, other than the CBC, it's been primarily owned by telcos, who didn't buy it for 16:9 cable TV.
Right.
So I think we're really in that last phase of going away from bespoke broadcast, and that everything is going to now support multimedia and the method of consumption, the time of consumption. I think it's been talked about, the convergence thing. We were talking about it 10, 12 years ago. Now it's how do we put it together? How do we do it? What's the infrastructure look like? What's the production workflow look like? And that's where we're at now. And I think you're going to see some, dramatic changes in the production workflow. The infrastructure we know is going to be some IP based, but you wouldn't have risked mixing an IP 2110 infrastructure with your file-based multimedia or your IT department now. And that's exactly what's going to happen going forward, because now 2110 has settled down. The practices around it are developing all the time. So I think it's a converged media. The production side of it is, I think, the last thing to fall. That control room, that the big production switcher, the audio guy, we'll still have that for certain things. Certainly sports is going to stay with it for a while, but the production side, I think, is the last part. We've automated playout, we've automated everything else. I think automating production is the last thing. And you can see the nuggets of it. You can't, but I think it'll be a finished thing next year.
And in your opinion as well is, do you feel that by these shows representing the vendors that support the broadcast entities, do you feel that the broadcasters are doing a good job with trying to keep up to that transition that they need to make? And I guess it's a two-part question. If they're doing a good job or they're struggling, are the vendors kind of helping boost or redirect the broadcasters on how to figure out how the next big thing is going to be?
That's a really, really good one. And people know me, I always pick up a thing and repeat it many times over. But I think if I could say one thing that's changed in the trade shows is the vendors would show up and say, here's my camera. You have to pick the best camera and you have to buy it. Here's my router. You have to pick the best router now and buy it. Now I think the vendors are listening to the customers and saying, oh, if I'm now telling my customer, tape formats, if you're old like me, you remember, oh my God, I've got to make a tape format decision because Sony and Panasonic have shown up with 2 different tape formats. I have to decide now, and there were these great big epic tape battles. Well, that's not
Yeah.
happening anymore. So I think what's happening now is the vendors that aren't listening have evolved out of the business, and the vendors that are being lighter and more agile are listening more and listening to those workflows and listening to the economic issues. Like it's you can't pretend it's not there anymore. So I think that's the big thing, is it's flipped between vendors saying, here's my new stuff, tell me what you're going to buy, to vendors saying, I need something to solve this problem. And saying that now enough years, and seeing the trends, the consolidation and everything, that the vendors are saying, oops, I better get ahead of this curve, or I'm not, as my sister says, I'm going to be that next dinosaur to slip into the tar pit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's the big change now, is it's really customers are telling vendors what they want versus vendors showing their wares. And that's probably the most important shift we've seen in the whole trade show mentality.
Mitoki was asking what is SAS software, and correct me if I'm wrong, but SAS software is software as a service. So it's a consumer that wants to have access to something will just sign up and download or access like Amazon cloud services or IBM cloud services, and it's just the consumer choosing
Yeah.
to.
It's a different model, and
Yep.
what's changing is now software companies, and we've seen it. Adobe is the same way. Microsoft soon won't allow you to keep your own Outlook files anymore. You're going to have to keep them with Microsoft. But now what we're seeing is customers saying, you must do this. We won't sell you the software anymore. On maybe the up it, and it does have a higher ownership cost over those years, even though you're not having to outlay something. The amortization of broadcast used to be much higher. It used to be between 7 and 11 years. That was a very common range, and the business was kind of geared towards that. So the business now is getting less capital, has less capital to spend, and the vendor base doesn't want to sell it. On the technology side, though, it has one key advantage. People would make a technology decision based on a 7 to 11 year amortization cycle. They'd make the big purchase and they'd live and die by it for the next, till that amortization cycle was complete. But now in the SAS model, somebody can spin something up for a couple of months and say, that works, I'm going to keep it. No, that doesn't work, I'm going to switch to something else tomorrow. So depending on the way they make contracts and things like that, it's making technology adoption far less risky, because you can just put as many nickels in the machine as you want, and stop when you don't want to play.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much, both Charles and Paul. If there's any other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. In the meantime, I'm just going to pass the ball over to Lawrence to finish the evening.
Thank you very much, Angel. I'm gonna still. The video. Where did that go?
Yeah, Angelique,
Hopefully.
hey, Lawrence, just before you start, there is a question from Brad in the question box.
Oh, let me just check. The one that was posted at 7:32.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Brad is asking, this is for Charles. Brad is asking, if lighting is not spectrally harmonious over the frame, the video cannot adjust just a section of that frame to correct it. 5 different inaccurate lighting lights, 5 different inaccurate lights lighting 5 people in the same frame cannot be corrected by the video operator. Charles, you muted.
Yeah, sorry, here I am.
Yeah.
Fix it in post. No, seriously, it's not an issue of color science. It's an issue of operations and production and lighting and issues like that. It doesn't really touch on the systematic issues of how you set up the signal chain. You know, we do certainly talk about mixed lighting. I mean, the technical term for that in the color science community would be mixed lighting, and it is an issue. But generally, the color science approaches to these things are across the whole image as it comes from the camera. So we're relying on the production designer, the lighting designer, the DOP to make sure that lighting is coherent enough that it's acceptable to the viewer.
Awesome. We also had another question from Mitoki and this one is for Paul. What recommended continued education is worth learning so old timers like myself and younger folks who want to remain in this broadcasting industry? So what would you recommend their education continue to be?
Boy, that's a really good one. And old timers like ourselves, including me, it's right now. I don't think there is a good place to find it. Certainly in the AI space, you're looking at all very bespoke offerings. I have the pleasure of going to the four main trade shows and the SMPTE MTS to do that. But it's really, I think it's really where the shows have taken on a life now is you're having to circulate and get many opinions to find a right one for yourself. So I can talk about these technologies and say that the only way we can do it is to literally go around and ask different people the same questions who are selling more or less the same products and try to formulate those answers ourselves. But we've had some changes at SMPTE, unfortunately, lately, and the education is where that needs to go. And I would say there's a big deficit there right now.
I agree. It's communities like these where everybody comes from different facets of the community and we continue to learn together and evolve together. That is key.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Lawrence, I think I don't see any other questions.
Good. Well, hello again. I hope you enjoyed the evening. I would like to thank our presenter and organizer, Paul, Charles, and Angèle. Following that, it's just a reminder of the beginning. A recording of tonight's meeting will be available on SMPTE Toronto channel at this address. And I will have Tony talk about our future meeting coming up.
Hey, everybody. Tony here. Yeah, just coming up in the next couple of months anyway. Next month, I think you might have seen that in the email blast that just went out for this meeting. We'll be back, SMPTE Toronto will be back at Profusion. We will have a booth. I believe it's 2806. As well, that first evening, November the 6th, we will have our section meeting there. So it's a little bit of a little road trip for people that are already in Toronto. We're still working on the logistics, but we're going to try and get this recorded but it will not be a virtual event. It's just a bit difficult getting out of the Metro Toronto Convention Center to the ether but we're looking into it. So and again, AI has been mentioned a couple of times, and we had a TTC on AI, but we're going to, from this perspective, because Profusion's more of a AV professional group, we're going to bring in a couple of speakers, Michael Martin and Paul Briscoe, that will talk about AI in still and video photography. That might change a little bit as well, but that's kind of the main theme on that one. We'll send an email blast, hopefully out by Friday of this week. Registration to the Profusion show is a must because there's guards at the entrance and you need a badge to get in. So there'll be more information on that to come. And it'll, just as a reminder, it will be early. It'll be a 5:30 start because the show on the first day ends at 7 o'clock. So gives us time for a beer afterwards, I guess. After November is December. Normally we have our holiday party then. We're again still working on this and how the logistics works. But we are going to go on another road trip for a tour and meeting at the Legislative Assembly of Ontario at Queen's Park. We haven't been there for quite some time, and the group has reached out and said, hey, wouldn't you mind coming and paying us a visit? And I think it's a great idea. Again, more information on that. The logistics of whether we have food or we don't have food is still being worked on. So again, just keep, and I think if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to pull up another screen for me here. I believe we are looking at December the 16th as the date for that one. So December 16th, again, we'll attach that to the next meeting notice so that at least you have another month in advance of when things really happen. January, we are looking at doing a social event and just making it a social event. We had one in June of one of the previous years at a restaurant. So we're looking at something of a similar vein as to just getting everybody to come along and, you know, have some food, maybe a libation or two, and just having a conversation as to, you know, what's on your mind, what can SMPTE do better, and things of that nature. February is, as our always has been for the last few years, a student focused. So we get the students from various colleges, universities to come to Metropolitan Toronto or Toronto Metropolitan University. Hopefully by then their new Eaton Theatre will be retrofitted with some. There are new seats in it now. There is a new projector, but there's a few things that are still missing. So it's good that we have a few road trips coming up that allow them to finish that off. March is, I've got that as to be determined, but it is not to be determined. It is a storage architect. So there's going to be a presentation on storage architecture of various, you know, on-prem or in the cloud. April, we don't have something earmarked, but we got a couple of things in the fire for that. May is the NAB wrap-up, because it's usually around that time. And June, we're going to try and do that barbecue thing again. So yeah, that's it for me, Lawrence.
Well, thank you, Tony. Before we finish, I have some other items to discuss. So please tell your friend to become a friend or a member of SMPTE. Also, you can find all our recording in the Toronto section YouTube channel as by the HTTPS, etc. You can review the video and also find update on our website at SMPTE.org section Toronto. Become a friend at this address. Connect with us on Twitter and by email at SMPTE Outlook.com. I hope you enjoy your time and you learn something valuable. And I hope to see you next time. And be well, stay safe. That's a wrap for now. Good night, everybody. Thank you.